What do our myths remember that history forgets? Today on Lead with Storytelling, I'm joined by Helen Nde, the brilliant mind behind the Mythological Africans community, one of the most respected platforms dedicated to exploring African folklore, mythology, and cultural memory. Helen is a researcher, writer, and cultural storyteller whose work has become a cornerstone for anyone seeking to understand the vast, interconnected world of African mythologies. Born in Cameroon and now based in Atlanta, she brings both a personal and scholarly perspective to how stories shape who we are and how we remember where we come from. Her newest book, The Watkins Book of African Folklore, is a sweeping, beautifully curated collection that celebrates the depth, diversity, and wisdom of African storytelling traditions. From the tricksters and creation myths to the ancestral tales that remind us of the sacred relationships between the seen and unseen worlds. Helen has also authored The Runaway Princess and Other Stories, a history of ghosts, spirits, and supernatural, and a history of astrology, divination, and prophecy, all of which reveal her deep commitment to exploring how myth and spirituality continue to shape the human experience. In this conversation, we talk about the enduring power of folklore, the importance of reclaiming African stories from colonial frameworks, and how myth can serve as both memory and map, guiding us towards identity, healing, and imagination. Let's dive in. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Soshi. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you on. And
Same. Same.
I made a mistake, actually. I should have said, we had two guests, or maybe even three. You and Tria.
Me and Shreya and Annie, who is currently having breakfast. And if you hear yowling in the background, that's her.
Oh boy. Thanks a lot for being here.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here.
And regular listeners will note when Sochi is really excited. They can always tell in the beginning. And I think this subject, or the subject we're going to be touching on in your book, is one of very special interest to me because besides being about besides being even remotely close to storytelling, it's about African orality or oral tradition. And I love that because most of the books that have touched my heart have been ones that have really employed the use of orality as a device in communicating or sharing a message. And African folklore seems to embed all of these elements. And having said that, I think I'll just spend just a minute to talk a little bit about the Watkins Book of African Folklore from my perspective, as I've read it and love it. So you have collected scores of stories from across Africa, and the structure of the book is one that's has categorized the stories into different sections. For instance, we have one that we have animal stories, we have creation stories, we have interpersonal relationship stories. We have stories that also touch on community, and this is a very important. I feel it's a very important book because the stories that have been told here are not such as you find just anywhere online, but stories that you have curated especially to convey a message about the importance of Africa's oral tradition and oral literature. And it's quite interesting because in trying to do so, you have employed your experience in this field to tread the fine line between justifying, or rather validating that Africa has not just had these stories But you've also touched on the fine point of how these stories vary from the way, I mean, in their origin, or the way that they were originally told, vary from the way that they are now being told, or were being told, that is from a certain point in Africa's history, by colonialists or by the missionaries, and after they've been, washed and rinsed, to rid them of the stink of heathenism and paganism. And I like that because, much as I'm a Christian, I do not shy from the fact that some of these stories were richer in their original form than they were, or and richer and truer in their original form than they were after being touched by missionaries or missionary educationists. So I want to thank you so much for being very truthful in the results of your research. I think it's a really important book, and then everyone who can pick it up. I'm sure will find value in that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sushi. I appreciate the glowing endorsement, and I mean, what I hear tells me that you've read the book really closely, which is, the best any person who writes can hope for. That the people who engage their work really give it the attention and thought. So, I really appreciate your words here.
Thank you so much. I think I feel honored by the fact that you even wrote it, and I got to share in that experience. Thank you again. Thank you for being here.
Of course.
Looking forward to conversations. So I guess I'll start off by asking, so what inspired you to take on this task of gathering and interpreting stories from across the continent?
Yeah, this is one of those things that I feel like it emerged from just being alive, being African myself, being in the diaspora, and realizing, the whole thing of, if you don't define yourself, somebody else will define you, and you'll have to live within the bounds of those definitions. And I was born and raised in Cameroon, and then I moved to the US as an adult. And it got to a point I kept thinking, a lot of people have a lot of ideas about who you are as an African person, as an immigrant. But those ideas rub up against my idea, my self-concept, my concept of the country and the community and the people I'm from. And I was finding out that there was some friction there that I didn't like. I love to read. I love to read fantasy. I love to read science fiction. I love to read, historical fiction. And what I kept seeing is that when I go into the niche that I like, spirituality and, call it new age if you want to, but the syncretism of different religious and spiritual and philosophical ideas, you would see very distinctly, the Western tradition. You see very distinctly the, Asian traditions, and you will see the Native American traditions. And pretty much it was clear where everybody stood, their gods, their goddesses, their folk tales. And then you come to the African continent and it's ancient Egypt, which, I mean, duh. It is ancient Egypt. And then it just kind of, moves around. There is Yoruba law, with the Orishas. There is Anansi. If you go really a bit further, you'll get, the trickster tales from South Africa, the different animal tales. But as a coherent body of mythology and folklore, I still wasn't getting a sense of, okay, this is what the African continent has to offer. Specifically, from being Cameroonian, I was thinking, okay, what do my own people have to offer? I'm from the northwest region of the country, and there's a very distinct cultural identity there. And so I was coming up short. So, and this, I was at a point in life where I felt, okay, I need to get a better handle on this, just so I can move through the world with a bit of more confidence, especially for the political moment that the US was in at that time. So I started looking, I started reading, I started looking at things online, and when I got a chance, I started sharing. And the great thing about it is that there were a lot of people there out there also who had the same question, who wanted to know, who wanted to understand, and who wanted sources. That's the important thing. Who wanted sources for the story, who wanted a clear sense of where this came from. These stories came from, how they have changed, how they have evolved, and what the implications of that are. So I pretty much fit myself into this niche of African mythology and folklore, but with a bit of a scholarly perspective, as you put it. So combining that storytelling and scholarly aspect, and I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did because it fulfilled a need for myself, but also enabled me to make the offerings that I've been able to make so far, and that has been quite fulfilling. Yeah.
Lovely. I like the fact that it was just as much personal for you as it was, a professional fulfillment. Um, because why would you be doing this anyway if you can't get joy from it personally, if you're sleeping and waking to this to this one thing. Yeah, so I'm happy for you. I'm happy that it's doing this much, yeah, giving you this much joy. And I acknowledge that African folklore is really diverse.
Yes.
um, but then even then it's they're all interconnected. And I got a sense of that even more with reading your to say the commentary, the references that you put in your book. But how do you navigate? Because we can also acknowledge that there are some regions that had something that bound them, either by the motifs, by metaphors, and sometimes even by myths, sorry, themes. But how do you navigate that? That balance between regional specificity and the shared, themes, the shared mythological themes.
Yeah. But that's a great question. Something I try to keep in mind as I look at stories, as I curate them, is just the environment out of which they emerged. So we personally, it wasn't until I started curating Mythological Africans that this became something I kept at the forefront of my mind. But the African continent, way before colonialism even showed up, was alive. There were people traveling, doing trade, exploring, discovering new places, encountering, all these animals and creatures and strangers. It was alive with activity, and just so much was going on. If you look at the Silk Road, it came into Egypt, but then it changed into the trans-Saharan trade routes that came all the way to West Africa. And then there was the Eastern African trade routes that went all the way down to South Africa. So that continent has always had something going on. And that's reflected in the stories that emerge from the continent. You talk about shared themes and regional specificity. That shows up that way because as people moved around, they took their stories with them. Imagine they didn't have TV, they didn't have cell phones. What do you do in the evening when it's time to settle down and catch your breath and then rest? You tell stories. These stories came from the depths of the continent flowing outwards, and from out of the continent going inwards.
Yeah.
So the themes would move around, and you would sit there hearing this person from this land that you literally just heard about that afternoon telling a story from their part of the world, and you're thinking, I see myself in that. I've had that experience. I've seen that creature. I've had that feeling in my body. I've had that thought, wow, this is amazing. So it was this, I feel like it was this organic process of people just realizing, I am here, I'm alive, and I'm with people who have had some of the same experiences, and I've also had new experiences, and the stories kind of coalesce around these realizations. And so what I find just fascinating is that there are some themes that are very persistent. right? Some ideas that are very, very persistent. No matter where you go, you see them. The idea of an underdog character taking on authority, which speaks to the common human experience where you
Yeah,
have hierarchical structures.
yeah,
You always have ways by which the people who are lower in the hierarchy will, speak truth to power to the people higher up in the hierarchy. You have stories of family bonding and family dysfunction. That is a human experience. You have stories that emphasize cooperation and the impact of not cooperating, the impact of not working together, especially given the times that people lived in. And that says something. You have stories of how death came to the world, and death is the most human of all experiences. So of course you have all these stories with regional specificity, but also so much variation that emerged around them. And so I think it's the most humanizing thing possible, these stories that emerged, because it was basically people just sitting there and having that light bulb moment. Wow, this is real. We're really here having this shared experience, and we have the stories to prove that this is real. And I delight in it. I just utterly delight in it.
speaking of delight, I was pleasant. I was delighted to read the trickster stories. I don't know, but I think trickster stories have this appeal. And of course, we're going to talk about modern storytelling and all the ways that our folklore has influenced modern day literature and movies and all that. But I want to riff off I want to net out just a little bit, if you indulge me. Um, and Nancy, I know you used for the ego. Okay, so in my place we call it Imbeku, Imbeku in Igbo, in Nigeria. Um,
As a
that's the
tortoise, right?
tortoise.
Yeah.
The tortoise Imbeku or Mbe. Um, and then we have the spider.
Mhm.
We have the spider. Of course, the Jamaicans share this heritage with us, so that makes total sense. But for me, in across the stories that you created, how these characters, actually traverse between different themes of healing, creation, of justice, while while we're very aware that they are being deemed as the evil ones. And it's a little bit while their roles are really 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 amoral, it's really about the flow, the natural course of, I mean, the course of nature, and how they keep the balance. That was, I think, that was what they were in. That was their intent. That was their purpose, more or less. But over time, they've been demonized, and so we have in Yoruba law, we have Eshu, or in the pantheons we have among the Orisha law we have Eshu. And in Christian perspective, Eshu is the devil.
Mhm.
So what was fascinating for me was to see to read the story of Modimo. Modimo. I think that's the South African origin. And Modimo, in the stories you shared, and I want to thank you for this. In the stories that you shared, Modimo was the creator of all, was like an all being. However, Modimo was being, according to the reference, and which was interesting for me to read, Modimo was being, how do they say it, denigrated or demoted to the god of the underworld, which the exact opposite. And many of these characters, we could go on and on about especially the spider as a motif, how they have divine they have divine attributes, or divine roles. They were divine. And we even have to prove that, I think in Cameroon, there is a divination, what's it called? Is a divination, not, is it tribe, tribe or cult that uses spiders, uses spiders as their, what do we say?
Like a totem.
Like, yes, exactly. So I love to read about those because for me they kind of represent this. Very obvious schism between the ways that these stories were originally meant to be told and the ways that they are now being interpreted. Because for me, these were the most fantastical and most intriguing characters that I ever read, that inspired even further reading for me. And I was really happy to see them see them being told in the way that they should be in your book. Again, thank you. But what do you think? Which stories were most interesting to you?
Oh my gosh, that's just about the worst question to ask, because it's almost like asking which child is your favorite child.
I won't tell them. I won't tell Tria. I won't tell anybody.
It's almost like asking which child is your favorite child. I will say I am I am partial to trickster stories as well. Because like you said, there is something just very human about them, right? I always think that one of the worst things that could have possibly, I mean, colonialism and all of that was just awful. But just when it happened, you had Europeans at one of the most repressive and restricted eras of their times coming up against the, open, ebullient, dynamic cultures of the world, not just the African continent, and then taking these rigid frameworks and just imposing them on these cultures. And now we have to deal with the fallout from that. And that speaks exactly to your point. Because, trickster figures in not just African folklore, in folklore from around the world, even in European folklore before, the Christian framework or adjacent type frameworks got imposed on them. Trickster figures were meant to be a way by which people came to terms with the trade-offs and the negotiations that they had to make with life. They emerged from the understanding that things are not always so cut and dried, black and white, right? A situation where doing something one way would be the right thing to do. You put it in another context, it would be the absolutely wrong thing to do. And so these trickster figures, one of the main roles they played was they were like a tool to stir different kinds of pots of soup, right? Sometimes you needed a ladle, sometimes you needed a spoon with a hole in it to mix things better. But they offered people a way they could make sense of the world while still maintaining balance, like you said, while still keeping things in a unified whole. And so then you entered, European explorers, missionaries who came with that rigid Christian idea of right or wrong, the Ten Commandments and all of that. And suddenly these, creatures, these figures, these ideas, these personas, these deities who were available to people to help them, settle a bit more comfortably into the human experience, became this source of strife, right? Became this source of strife. Because you can imagine in a situation where a person found themselves having to make a hard judgment call, having to choose one option, the lesser of two evils, so to speak. Suddenly you're left with no psychological scaffolding to kind of help you navigate the fact that, okay, you had two terrible choices and you had to make the best of one. But that is a very, very human, so we got robbed in that sense, right? Africans and indigenous peoples of the world, we got robbed of these ways that we had developed to help us make sense of life. And even more, you had, the idea of a supreme being in the African context is this all-pervading entity, right? Sky-based, but then that's only because the sky is everywhere, at the same time, So not sky based in the sense of a God in heaven, although I feel like that idea emerged from the sense that, okay, God is everywhere, everything under heaven literally is everything.
Present.
But, it's not just in the sky, it's on the ground, is in the trees, is in the stones. These are all emanations of this supreme being. But then in the case of Modimo, one phrase that referred to Modimo being, on the ground, and suddenly there was this interpretation that said, okay, the underworld, Hades, Satan, evil, and it's it's a little disturbing how often that happened, and kind of speaks to the presumption of the colonial enterprise, which I'm not going to start on that, but um, I think there's been an incredible amount of work since then to kind of push back against that, to say, hey, this is not quite what was going on here, right? The perspective out of which these stories came was different. So it's not even something you can compare. I think about one of the instances of this that really, where it kind of hurts, honestly, is the case of the Bleaks. I think Bleakman. I always mix that up. The Bleaks, who collected stories from the San and other Southern African Bushmen, as they call it, right, the hunter-gatherer tribes, and they did an amazing job. In all fairness, they worked with people, extractive as these things tended to be. But what emerged was one of the most thoroughly documented archives of San storytelling in the world that exists ever. But then a lot of the stories also got filtered through their sensibilities, because you think about the reality of life for these indigenous African people, some of the oldest African peoples. They've been there forever. What have they not seen, right? What have they not heard? What have they not done? What have they not experienced? And they were very real in how they captured these stories. They didn't sanitize them. They didn't gloss over the harshness of life. They didn't gloss over the way, you know, they say it's life in the jungle. It's survive by all means necessary. They basically just told their stories as it was. But then there was something very poetic in how they did this. There was something very ethereal in how they told their stories. And so one of the criticisms of the archives that these people put together is that they basically try to erase the grimmer aspects of it, the real aspects of it, and in that sense kind of stripped these people of some of what made their storytelling so alive. And then what's even worse, as time went on, Europeans were coming in, other African migrations were coming in, these people started losing more and more of their native land, their heritage, their culture. So it basically being attacked on two fronts, if you want to think about it. Their stories started reflecting this reality. They became, a bit harder, a bit darker. And it was this constant tension of, okay, how can we take this? Because it was the idea that, these stories are for children. We can't take these dark things and make them available to children. And so a lot of that got lost in the process, which is really sad. But you don't have to dig too deep beneath the surface to really just arrive back at these realities, because in many ways the stories were told as they were told, and it's worth a look. It's worth a look, because I feel like and it's me standing on my soapbox about this, we have a lot to learn, as you said in the beginning of the discussion. We have a lot to learn from the old stories. As Africans, we have a lot to learn about who we are, about the path we've walked to where we got to, things that history just won't communicate as well, things that material culture will point at. But if you don't have an understanding of the cultural framework, you wouldn't be able to make sense of that piece of art or that design on that calabash, on that piece of cloth. And so I think this just the idea that so much has been subject to misinterpretation and distortion is all the reason to pay very close attention to these stories, because we need them to make sense of ourselves and of the world that we have inherited from that era.
Well, I think one misunderstanding that the well colonialists had was that we didn't have. It's not colonialists now, but let's say it all depends. And correct me if I'm wrong. There was a misunderstanding that because our traditions were being transmitted orally, that we did not have a written culture. Um, but that couldn't be further from the truth because, for instance, in Igbo, we had the Inri, and I know the Yorubas they also had their own code, the scripts rather. They had their own script for documenting and for transcribing or transmitting information. So I'm very cognizant that you're also in your own, through your lens, trying to also maintain a balance between orality, what is oral and what is written. But in that materiality, there's that balance in terms of addressing materiality. But as far as oral tradition, has a role to play in African heritage, and you could do a little bit on what those roles might be. How do you approach translating what is oral, the oral richness, into written form without losing essence?
That's a difficult question for me to answer, because the bulk of my work emerges from the written tradition, right? There's a term, Valentin Mundimbe, the late Congolese philosopher, uses. It's like the colonial archives of something something. There's a way he frames it, which is absolutely true, right? It's not like I traveled to these different African countries and met these different peoples and wrote the stories down that the storytellers of the communities were telling. So 100% worked with the written archive. But these written archives were documented from oral traditions. So the main thing for me is to stay aware of it, to just always maintain the awareness that there is a layer of meaning that I am possibly not getting, because this is a primary source, but it's a primary source that has another precedent. So I could be using a text from the 1700s or the 1800s, but before that text came into existence, there are storytellers from the 1600s, 1500s, 1400s who have been telling these stories, and this is just a version of that story that has been told and captured in time, set in pen and set in ink and paper, and settled there. So for me, it's just maintaining that awareness that this is one way the story has been told, and staying open to other ways in which the story could possibly have been told. And I try to do that in the commentary of my book, to say, okay, this is where this story was documented as like the first instance as far as I'm aware of, and these are the other places in which it has been documented. These are the other versions of it that exist, and these are the different shapes it has taken in different contexts. But then that is the essence of storytelling. Most stories are not, especially folk tales and myths. In some cases, they are fixed stories that were told a certain way at a certain time for a certain purpose. So that's absolutely the case in some stories. But for the most part, stories were tools that people used in the communities share ideas, to explain situations, to help people process something that has happened so they would change, and that's something that the documented aspect kind of got in the way of, because the thing is, once you write something down, then you get attached to it as the original version, and it takes away from that. But even then, we'll get to it later, like you said. We see even in the documented aspect that people will take stories and retell them and weave them into new narratives, into more modern, storytelling formats, into new ways of engaging the world. Now we have, people on TikTok, we have people on Instagram, we have people on Twitter, we have, people making short films, we have people, making art. That is the way of stories. So more and more, I find myself again, like I said, keeping an awareness that okay, these stories came from somewhere. They came out of a tradition, which is not dead. The oral aspect of African storytelling is very much alive. It's changing, right? It's changing. It's adapting to time and new technologies. But then that's the way of things, because at one point in time, people in Western Africa, Mali, Senegal, told the stories without the Quora, and then the Quora came in, and this was a new technology that facilitated storytelling. There was a time when the rattles and the sound effects and everything else that storytellers have been known to use didn't exist, and then people learned from observing, from having an experience and trying to find the best way to communicate that experience, costumes and all of that. Things evolve. So I'm training myself to be open, and that's something that we really really need to remember. African societies of the past were the most open, the most adaptive. People wanted to learn. People wanted to have new experiences. People wanted new technology. People wanted new methods. People were always ready to, okay, how can we incorporate this idea into our milieu and make our lives better? And it was no different with the storytelling.
I'd like to add that you from even reading the book, there was that I got a sense of your humility, as in presenting yourself, being open to the possibility that there are things that you might have missed, or there are things that have not been made aware to you. In speaking, and I want to thank you for that, because it made the work even more accessible, and so thank you so much. So colonial narratives have often diminished African mythologies. We've touched on a few of the ways that has. But how can we reclaim and reframe these stories? I believe this book is one of the steps that we're taking towards that this effort of reclamation. What other ways can we reclaim, especially for contemporary audiences?
Another really great question. After writing this book and after curating Mythological Africans for the time that I've curated it for, I find myself in a position where I start to wonder about reclaiming and reframing, and if there is another way we can approach, because my thing with reclaiming and reframing is it almost rests on an understanding that colonialism just completely wrested these things out of our hands. That's not completely true, right? That's not completely true. African cultures are still very much alive, right? They've changed radically, but they're still very much alive. In many ways, we retain that agency. Now, in the past, not the case now, we didn't have platforms the way we have now to communicate these ideas, but now we do, right? And so if there is any reclamation or reframing to be done, for me, it's just us being more present, more vocal about saying, okay, there is that version of the story, but this is a way of looking at it, and this is another way of looking at it, and this is a new way of looking at it that emerges from these things that have happened. So there is no acting as if something was irrevocably taken away, because that's not the case. There is no acting like it is not in the nature of human evolution and storytelling for things to change, sometimes even through violent means. It's to basically accept. I think that's a point I'm getting to. Just accept that, okay, these terrible things have happened, but they are not the only things that have happened. And to stand on them with our 2 feet and say, okay, we are acknowledging that these things have happened, and we are going to move forward and tell stories that don't deny these terrible things, but also show that we have learned from them, we have emerged as a changed people, a people who have encountered the world, who have wrestled with the world, and in many ways have prevailed. You know, so if there is any reclamation or reframing to be done, that's the direction I'm going in. To just not deny what has happened, the terrible and awful, but also to remember that through it all we prevailed. There are so many ways in which we prevailed, and the cultures have not died. They've not been taken away from us. We still have them. It's just really up to us now to use the available platforms to continue them with the awareness of things that have happened.
So true. So true. Thank
Yeah.
you for that.
And if I may give an example. So did you ever get to watch the movie The Woman King?
Yes.
Yeah. Love that movie. Oh my gosh. I love that movie. But that movie is not a faithful account of reality. It's
No.
not, right? And I think that is the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Right. Everybody knows what happened in Dahomey. Right. The good, the bad, the ugly. We all know. Everybody knows what happened in ancient Rome. Everybody knows what happened in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, in Europe everybody knows, India, China. That has not stopped every kind of story to be told about these cultures. Right. It's not denying history. It's saying, hey, this is a possibility. Now, what I would like to see, right? What I would like to see is a story that wrestles with the difficulty of the kingdom of Dahomey. Is a story that, say, takes an Agoji, right, and says this was a woman who served at the pleasure of the king, who went on the slave raids, who contributed to some of these terrible things that happened in this part of the African continent, and then who eventually had to turn around and defend her country or defend her people from the way the French enterprise just came in and tried to destroy everything, and ultimately didn't succeed because they were defeated. But to have a person go on that journey, come to terms with the realities of her existence, because you look at how the Agoji became Agoji, by modern standards, what in the world, we wouldn't stand for that now. It was
Not very savory details.
no, oh my God. Also, to have what I would like to see is a movie, that wrestles with that. We have creative license, right? We still own our stories. A movie that takes a woman from when she was a child, aspiring to be the greatest Agoji ever, because these women in many ways loved, especially the warriors. You hear some of their war songs and they lived for the battle, And then she has that moral crisis of, okay, if what we're doing is the right thing to do, how come so many of our own are being sold off? And how come we're finding ourselves in this conflict of having to defend ourselves from people who we thought of as allies? To have that moral crisis to go through the defeat, to, have that crisis moment, catharsis, and then what emerges from that. So that's what I'm talking about. To take our history in our own hands fully, right? If we're reframing, if we're reclaiming, to reclaim all the bits of it, not just the parts that we want to, the bright, sparkly parts that we want to embrace the full humanity of it. And that is one of the conversations I had when the Woman King came out, because a lot of people were like, this is not true, this is not, this is a historical, it's not right. And I couldn't disagree. But it was also a really good movie. It was a really great movie that brought something to the table. It was a perspective, right? And it wasn't out of place for the moment, right? It was an offering of what might have been, pointing to what could be. But I say balance it out, right? As we take our narratives, balance it out. And you know who did this in just deliciously? The South African production on the life of Shaka Zulu. Now this is a
Which year?
multi-series,
On
the most recent one.
the what?
There is a
Recent-
very recent one from maybe like 5 or so years ago,
Oh,
and
really?
it's all in Zulu, 100% in the Zulu language. And it is a gritty, just real. They don't shy away from the reality of the Shaka Zulu's rise to power, and then how that evolved. And I think that was perfect. I think it was perfect.
I didn't know they had because I watched the not 80s, was 80s 90s version. Yeah, yeah, and
There is a new one.
it's so there's a new one. I'll look out for that one because I watched that one. It was as gritty. Every time I hear Shaka Zulu, yes, I can. The name kind of conveys the grit, the grim, the grim stories around that name, his victories, his trials. It was a very human story. I think I remember it vaguely, but I know there was a thing with his mother, and then the prophecy as well. And we're going to touch on prophecy, please. I know. I promised I was going to be respectful of your time, but we need to talk about prophecy as well. Yeah, but don't let me net that on that one either. So this is another. But thanks for saying that. I mean, because it was a good segment. I was just about to ask you which works, and it's a good thing you brought up the Woman King as an example. And one work that came to mind is Tunde Leye's. I don't know if you got a chance to Afonja. This is the Afonja the Fall. This a sequel to Afonja the Rise, and it's a work of. I'm going to keep it here because I'm supposed to do a review. It's a work of historical fiction.
Mhm.
I know that, but he tried as much as possible to be true to history. And at the time the Afonja the Rise, the first book came out, and I did a review of that too. A lot of conversations came up about the history of the Oyo Empire.
Okay.
And I know that the Dahomey, they had overlaps, and
Yeah.
they had their wars, yes, between them. And so when you mentioned the issues you had with that, I remember the conversations that went on right at the release, following the release of the movie, about historical fidelity, how faithful it was to history. And I think a lot could be done. But again, every director has, and every filmmaker has the bane of, the responsibility of, bringing to for his perspective or his angle. And sometimes the work myself might be a snapshot of a certain time within a whole a timeline, just a small part of it. And I can understand that, and I can respect that. But just you've actually delivered so beautifully the need, the relevance of filmmakers or storytellers to be faithful to some to most of those elements as best as they can in order to be able to transmit the heritage of those stories and the values in those stories. Thanks a lot for saying that. But
Of course.
not to let you off the hook just yet. What about, because we're doing a lot of reading, right? Sometimes we don't have time for Netflix. So which fantasy novel to you that you read tells or speaks of or delivers African mythology in as you could tell in the most faithful way?
That is a good.
I have a few names.
Oh, let me see. Are we talking contemporary?
Let's
Or
do one contemporary. Let's do one maybe not pre-colonial, post-colonial.
if we're talking, not in the last, let's say, 15 years, I'm sorry, Amos Uchuola is always going to win. Because, the palm wine drinkard is the
Amos
OG.
Ochoa.
Yeah, the OG of, African writing that brings in the mythology and folklore aspect. And it's a trip of a book. I love it so much because he just laid it out there, right? And the book received a lot of criticism for
Of
that,
course.
but it really, you don't get better than that. You really don't. You really don't get better than that. Now, contemporary, whew, man, that's hard.
I know it's hard. But don't worry. Internet will forgive you if you pick one. I hope.
That's hard.
Well, is that a problem? If it's hard, is that a problem?
No, because they're I like things for different reasons. Well, contemporary, I will go with Ibrahim Al-Koni. Ibrahim Al-Koni is from Libya, and he writes about Tuareg mythology and folklore, and the Tuareg are the desert nomads.
Yeah.
And his book, it has different names. In the original Arabic name is Al-Majus, like the magicians, but it's been called the animists, it's been called the fetishists, and there's all that conversation about colonial language. But what I like about it is that it basically, it's an experience. The book is this big. Let's start there.
I'm going to find it.
No, you should. It's must reading. It's this big, and it basically tells it tells a story of the Tuareg people at a time when it was this tussle between colonial influence, Arabic influence, and and then you have the Africans on the coast figuring that out, and they were kind of caught in the middle. And so there are multiple storylines going on at the same time. There is this, young man who has this beautiful singing voice, this gift. And instead of integrating into his community, he's more interested in wandering the hills and getting to know nature. And he has all these girls in the village in love with him, and he couldn't care less. You had the servants, the slave class, and their issues with, the elite class. You had this one, the leader of the people who was dealing with whether or not to trade in gold, which to the people was like, that's the devil's metal. We don't want anything to do with it. But then that's where there was money. You had rivalries between community leaders. Like, it's just so much is going on in the story, and it's all set in the context of their migrations across the desert. And one thing I came to find out through reading this book about the Tuareg people is that they have an amazing oral culture, right? To the highest form of prestige is to be able to communicate in poems. and to play the musical instrument, and you could basically get anything you wanted in life if you could put it to a good poem. And just because they lived so close to the land, the desert was basically the backdrop of their every thought and experience. They have an amazing, just intense folkloric tradition around that. The geography of the desert, the spirit of the desert, the sheer presence. So the book is called The Tuareg Epic, and I agree. It has that sense of broad, sweeping themes, but then with minor storylines that carry the people through this journey that they are on, and then there is a climax. And so I would say, if there is a modern book, if you want to call it that, that really integrates African mythology and folklore, I can't think of a better. Like, that would have to win. That would absolutely have to win. There's no comparison in my mind, at least.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wow. That's one thing I like taking away from my conversations is new book recommendations. I'm going to put that down. Maybe give myself one as a Christmas gift.
And I really like that book also because you speak English, I speak English. English is like the lingua franca of the world. And so what tends to happen is that mythologies and folklore from the English-speaking part of the continent dominate the narrative. But a huge chunk of the African continent is French-speaking, is Arabic-speaking. And so if we are not careful in our curation of these stories, we leave them, we don't give them the proper place that they deserve. And that's something I try to pay attention to. And then I, happened upon this gem. And, the Animus is not the only book he has written. He has written so many books. Just all the aspects of Tuareg mythology and folklore, and how it intersects with the mythology and folklore of ancient Egypt, because geographically these, Libya and a lot of these Saharan communities draw inspiration. If you talk about, the Amazi people, the Berber, if you want to call it that, they have a lot of intersection with ancient Egypt, and that was a revelation to me because ancient Egypt has always been its this class of its own, and to see that, hey, no, people were moving around. They more than likely also took stories from the communities around them and integrated them into their grand mythological structure. So that was an eye opener, and I'm glad I read the book. It's definitely one of my favorites for sure.
Interesting. Now, someone who curates and studies folklore, how do you see myth functioning as both history and prophecy? I said we're going to touch on prophecy, but also as a record of what was, but not just as record of what was, but also a vision of what could be.
What could be. This goes back to the comment I made in the beginning of how stories are or in many ways the organizing principle, right? You tell yourself a story about who you are, and that story kind of becomes the way you understand yourself, the way you move through the world, and your future, if you think about it. So if you tell yourself you are of a great people, you are of a noble people, this is what is expected of you, these are the standards of behavior, standards of engaging the world, this is the pattern you will follow, this is your future. You tell yourself your future and you follow it. And you also remind yourself, and I think that's why in pretty much all human cultures, genealogies are so important, because this is people saying, these are my forebears going back however many generations, right? And then you look at naming traditions, son of this, child of this, person of this house. I think the Bambara people of Mali are really, really good with this. They the, and even in Yoruba culture, the singing of your oriki is almost like capturing the essence of who you are, and it's prophecy in that sense. It's saying, okay, this is what you're established in, and this is your potential. So I think what myths do that for people on a larger scale, gives them a grounding in, in his history, the word. I don't know that history is the word. In existence, in evolution, to say, okay, this is where you came from, and because this is the path you're on, these are the possibilities for you in the future. But prophecies are not fixed, they're not carved into stone per se. They can evolve in different directions depending on the actions that the people take. And so, in the same way, you have this story that tells a possibility, but it depends on how you move through the world. It depends on what is happening in the world at any given time, the other people present, and they will influence the way that prophecy evolves. But the prophecy always has that motion, and that's what the myths and the stories, I think, to answer your question, they've set into motion a sequence of events of understanding, of being, and you move through them. So it's not a neat answer, but I think that's, at least that's my understanding of myths as, memory and prophecy. They preserve something, but then they also open a possibility, a pathway that you could follow.
Yeah, I mean, I can sense your not so much as not agitation, but it's this inadequacy of vocabulary for certain things, and I think that's a good seg into. It's a good seg that as in certain things that you not to say are not so tangible, not so
right.
not as,
You feel into them. You find yourself in them. You
exactly,
kind
and
of
I guess that's
have an understanding, a felt sense of, okay, this is something I am living at this time, and it's hard to articulate. I'm sure there are words out there that will, just get to the core of it. But when you see me starting to do this, it's because I'm like,
well,
I feel it in my body. I just don't know which words to use to express it here.
well, then brace yourself, because my next
Oh,
question, my next next question has to do with even more the more intangible, because you've written about ghosts, spirits, and astrology and prophecy. So these are themes that often make people uncomfortable. So I can sense if you're uncomfortable with, or not uncomfortable. Again, there's this insufficiency of lexicon, or of language, to certain times communicate these things. But so what do you think these recurring motives, tell us about human connection to the unseen world?
And before I say anything on that, so no, just a clarification, because I don't want to take credit for anybody's work. The books, A History of Ghosts, Spirits, and also A History of Astrology, is a collection. So I contributed to them. I didn't author the whole book. I couldn't possibly have authored those books because it spans, human understanding of these ideas. But then you answered your own question, because you think about, you have these 2 volumes with representation from every corner of the world. And I'm not even kidding. Every people, every continent, every era of time is represented in these books. You're talking about ghosts, spirits, the undead, and the supernatural. If you're talking about divination, prophecy, and fortune telling, there's an entry in each of these books from every corner of the world, from every time of human history. And that tells you that this is something that is so fundamental, is so present, is so real, is so universal. And I think it goes back to the realization, right, that there is so much more that we don't know, right? It's that person sitting around a fire, the jungle around them, listening to somebody from a part of the world that they literally just heard about that afternoon, telling a story that strikes such a deep chord in them. It is that sense of shared mystery, that sense of there is so much more to this world that than I could possibly conceive of, but there is another person who's experiencing the same thing with me. And there is more even after life ends, because the idea of spirits, there is more beyond the material world that we experience. The idea of spirits, the idea of ghosts, the idea of the intangible, like you said, it's universal. And what I really what I appreciate about getting a chance to write these entries is because they really made me, in order to present a balanced and accurate account, it made me go take a closer look. Like I remember when I was doing the research for the entry on zombies in Haitian culture and just tracing where they emerged from on the African continent, because a lot of what we see in Caribbean, Afro diasporan cultures have, you can almost draw a line from where they are in, the diaspora to where they emerged from on the African continent. And the amazing thing about, zombies, that whole cult, that whole area of belief, is that it came from a little bit from all over. There are aspects of it that came from Congo culture. There are aspects of it that came from more Nigeria, Benin. There are aspects of it that came from elsewhere. And then in the melting pot of the Afro diaspora, they coalesced around their experience there. But the threads, you can clearly see the threads of where they emerged. And you had people from, you take a given plantation, you had people from all over, and they were talking to each other and trying to make sense of their reality. And then, they said, well, this is a situation where you're alive, but you're not really here, which, when you think about it, that's the life of being enslaved. You're here, but you're not really here, because so much of what makes you human has been taken away from you, right? And you're kind of stuck in this reality where you can't go home without giving up an essential part of you. You can't return to yourself. And then you transition into modern culture where technically slavery has ended, but because you're transitioned into this modern industrial culture that still needs your labor, you're not as free as you imagine yourself to be. So that place of here but not here, neither here nor there, being caught in an in-between, twilight zone, if you want to think about it like that, it comes so clearly, and it rests on a shared understanding. So it's, again, stories, myths, folklore are just about the most humanizing technology, if you want to call it that, we have available to us right now. And I will say this over and over again, if you are not paying attention to them, especially in the world that we live in now, if you're not paying attention to the stories that have held humanity together so far, we are going to lose out on a lot. You're going to lose out on a lot, because the world is changing at an amazing pace, and the changes, on the surface look like the best thing since sliced bread. But if we are not paying attention to how they are changing the way we relate to ourselves and to each other, we will find ourselves holding the broken pieces of our communities and not sure how we got there. I read an article recently where the author was making the argument that social media has basically turned the world into a village, which on the surface sounds amazing. We're all connected. We look out for each other. We care about each other's causes. And that's great. That's an amazing part of social media. But then you have to remember also that many villages relied on a culture, shared culture norms, and use these shared norms to enforce standards in a way that could be really coercive sometimes and damaging. Right. Now imagine that on a global scale. It's one thing if you have your village of 2,500 people. It's something else if you have
Billions.
100 million people who sometimes don't even have a context for that experience that you're involved in. All they see is a 30-second clip of you in a situation, and then suddenly you are the viral moment. Everybody has an opinion on who you are and what you do. It affects your job, it affects your family life. It could literally tear your life apart. But that's the world we are in. That's the moment we're in. And so my push has always been, let's remember what holds us together. Let's remember the ambiguities that are inherent to human life. Let's remember the trade-offs that we all have to make to get through life. Let's remember the values that make for better societies. Let's remember the values that make for not so great societies. And the way I see it, stories, right? Stories, no matter how you're telling them, whether it's, a short film, a TikTok video, an Instagram reel, art, however you're communicating these human your podcast, however we're having these conversations, keeping these ideas and ideals alive. It's so important to this moment, else we will literally forget who we are and become machines.
Helen, I could not have put it in, for a closing comment. Thank you so much, because you took the next question out of my mouth, and how, any closing remarks you may have about how storytelling, or African folklore could change the way we see myth altogether. And that was you said that beautifully. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, I did say we had a special segment in this.
Oh no!
Don't worry, it's not the one that makes you want to jump out of your seat. So it's a rapid fire questions that I usually have as a warm up for my guests.
Let's do it.
It's even lighter than the heavy questions, or the questions that we've asked previously. Okay, you ready?
Ready. Let's go.
All right. What's your go-to comfort food?
Ooh. Cheese and crackers and fruit.
Ooh, okay. Let's keep it alive.
Yeah.
If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
Oh my gosh. Wow. See, gosh, I'm going to overthink this. Who would it be? Oh my gosh. I'm overthinking it already.
Slide from your lips to the universe.
Oh my gosh, who would it be? I have so many people I want to talk to. Can we come back to that one?
Okay, all right. Wow.
I literally cannot decide.
Just made it heavy. Oh my god. Okay.
I literally cannot, I've had 50 names go through my head just right now for different reasons.
I tell this means a lot to you. Okay.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, let's come back to that one.
Beach or mountains?
Ooh. Beach.
Yeah. You're getting lost for a moment. So
Mountain.
I thought I sensed that coming.
Mountain near a beach.
Okay.
I need to give you context for this. I need to give you context for this.
Okay.
Boya, the town where I grew up, is literally on a mountain, an active volcano at that, which erupted in my lifetime.
Ooh.
So I grew up with a mountain just always in my consciousness. But then the school I went to 30 minutes away is in Nde on the Atlantic Ocean. So for 6 years of my life, I grew up with the ocean. So it was literally mountain on this side of my peripheral vision and ocean on this side of my peripheral. So those, you should have said I don't know, beach or forest or something, because it's like I'm caught between my father and my mother right now.
I'll let that pass. I'll take it.
But because where I am right now, I want to relax and take it easy. I'll say beach.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Favorite book that impacted your life?
Ooh. I'm gonna give respect where respect is due here. I'm going to say the Bible because for the longest time, I was a Christian for a very long time. I don't, consider myself a Christian anymore. But I would say that was the first book of myths and folk tales I was ever really introduced to. So, and it had quite the impact on my life. So, I would give the Bible that.
All right. What's a skill you've always wanted to learn but haven't had the chance to yet?
Ooh. Sculpting.
Nice.
So,
Nice.
well, sculpting or pottery. Yeah, not sculpting, not stone pottery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we're back to the question.
Oh my gosh. Historical figure. Ah, man. That is a good one. I'm going to say, I'm going to say her name wrong. Hatshepsut, the woman fair.
Okay.
And basically, I was going through historical figures and for different reasons. But I would say her because I cannot imagine what that experience was like. I cannot, because I've read a couple of stories about her life, and to have been so impactful that people went out of their way to erase you from history. That's something. That is something. To have been so impactful, so game-changing, that after you die, people go out of their way to erase you from the historical record. Now, that's a story I want to hear from her perspective. So, yeah.
I think that would be interesting indeed. I mean, it's also the story of almost every woman.
And that the list of names going through my head was just different women in history who, just were game changing and have not ever really had, well, not anymore, that's changing, but for the longest time where, their stories were not fully known and understood, and she's definitely one of them. Yeah.
Awesome. Helen, thank you so much. You've been
Thank
phenomenal.
you.
And this conversation could not have gone any better. I mean, this was better than I even thought it would be because, hey, look at the time.
I know.
You thought you couldn't make it. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the gift of this book that you've shared with us and the stories that you've told. We're looking forward to all your future projects, and that you can trust I'll definitely be following.
Well, thank you for having me and for reading and enjoying the book. That's just about the best compliment you could possibly pay. So my deepest appreciation for that. And for having me on the podcast. I quite enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.